Her name was Lamo Changring, a quiet woman from a valley where the wind carried the smell of juniper and snow, and where people learned early that speaking too loudly could cost you everything. Yet tonight, as she knelt on the temple courtyard stones, the world shrank to one sensation: the dry scrape of the rope around her wrists. That sound would follow her through every memory to come. It would become the sound of fear itself. The monks didn't shout. They didn't threaten. They simply accused her of sheltering a fugitive rebel. No trial, no defense. Only the scrape of rope pulled tighter. Lamo looked small beneath the towering prayer flags, yet something in her face, some stubborn spark, offended them. Maybe it was the same spark they had spent centuries trying to stamp out in women who talked back, women who refused arranged marriages, women who dared hide sons who refused to kneel. Tibet's mountains keep their secrets, but its silence has always been a weapon. And tonight, that silence was about to be broken by bone. The torture they chose for her was never spoken aloud. It didn't need a name. It didn't have some theatrical symbolism like the rack or the wheel. No, this one belonged to the shadows of the monastery, whispered only among the men who believed they had divine permission to break a woman slowly enough that she remembered each second. 4 ropes, 4 angled poles, and the woman they needed to make an example of. When they dragged Lamo to the center, she didn't scream. She only inhaled sharply as her knee struck the frozen ground. But the rope scraped again, slow, rough, deliberate, and her breath trembled. That tiny sound, that single scrape, was the first crack in the shell of someone who still believed mercy was possible. Narrators of history often pretend cruelty has a logic, but here there was none. This was domination dressed as discipline, control disguised as tradition, and every viewer should hear this clearly. This channel exists to expose the systems that thrive behind silence. If you believe these stories deserve daylight instead of erasure, stay with us and subscribe to keep this archive alive. The executioners worked without looking at her face. They tied her ankles first, spreading her legs at unnatural angles, the cold stones biting through her thin wool dress. Then her arms, pulled upward, outward, until her shoulders trembled involuntarily. And still, that rope scraped. The first pull wasn't meant to hurt. It was meant to frighten. A sudden jolt that snapped her posture wide, shocking her muscles into spasm. Lamo gasped, not from pain, but from the realization this wasn't punishment. It was dismantling. This torture was designed for sound. Not screams, those came later, but internal sound. The soft tearing of ligaments, the wet pop of cartilage shifting, the grinding whisper of bone beginning to drift from its home. But above all, the rope scraping. Always the rope. The monks recited prayers as they pulled, each tug wider, slower. They stretched her like a map someone was trying to redraw. Her shoulders began to quiver uncontrollably. Her hips strained. Her elbows flared with sudden electric pain. And then, her right shoulder dropped. A dislocation is not cinematic. It's quiet. A dull, fleshy thump inside the body. But Lamo's face twisted, her lips trembling as she tried not to cry out. Pride fights pain, but pain always wins. A soft whimper escaped, and the monks nodded, satisfied. The second pop came from her knee. Twisted sideways, the joint shifted with a nauseating crack that echoed across the courtyard. The rope scraped again as they adjusted the angle, and Lamo felt her vision dim, her pulse thundering in her ears. By now, she understood the truth. This wasn't execution. It was a message. A slow unraveling meant to show every girl in the valley what happened when a woman dared act without permission. But the worst part wasn't the joints. It wasn't even the slowness. It was the silence. Only the rope broke it. Scrape, scrape, scrape. And somewhere deep inside her, something began to break with it.
The courtyard changed once Lamo's joints began to fail. The monks didn't rush, they didn't gloat. Their cruelty lived in stillness, in the way they measured each pole as if adjusting a ceremonial instrument. And through it all, that same sound lingered, the dry scrape of rope sliding over wood, a rhythm older than memory, older than mercy. To understand this torture, you must first understand its purpose. This wasn't designed to kill. It wasn't even designed to incapacitate. It was designed to erase defiance. The body was the parchment. The joints were the ink. And the monks believed that if a woman could no longer lift her arms or stand without collapsing, she could no longer rebel, no longer hide fugitives, no longer refuse the marriages arranged for her. Control through disassembly. They called it making the body humble. 4 poles anchored at slight, deliberate angles. Not too wide would tear her apart too quickly. Not too narrow would allow her strength to resist. These monks weren't executioners, they were engineers of suffering. Lamo's wrists were already swelling purple from the strain. The ropes dug so deeply into her ankles that thin lines of blood began to drip down her heels. Every tiny shiver of her body made the rope scrape again, that same scratch, 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 like some invisible animal gnawing at her spirit. When the next pull came, it wasn't strong, just precise. A tightening that forced her left leg back a few centimeters more. Her hip joint strained, then rotated slightly, jutting outward at an unnatural angle. She inhaled sharply, her breath quivering in the cold morning air. The monk leading the ritual murmured a chant, but his voice wasn't calm. It was clinical, detached, as though her body were merely a lesson, a warning carved in flesh. Resistance is the root of suffering, he recited. But this wasn't spiritual. This was political. The monasteries had long relied on absolute obedience, especially from women. A woman who hid rebels threatened control. A woman who refused an arranged marriage threatened lineage. A woman who disobeyed a monk threatened the myth of moral authority. And nothing frightened them more than a woman who thought for herself. Lamo's right ankle rotated next. Not a snap, just a long, slow twist until her foot pointed nearly backward. The pain was monstrous, overwhelming, a white-hot scream tearing through her muscles. She bit it back, hard enough that her lips split. Blood dripped onto the ground beneath her, staining the snow-dusted stone. The monk gave a small nod. She was breaking exactly as they wanted. And then came the phase they called the softening. A staged sequence of pulls. First, the arms. Then, the legs. Then the coordination. Opposing limbs tugged at once, designed to scatter her body's natural alignment. Her limbs shuddered with each adjustment, and always, the rope scraped. At this point, the joints weren't just dislocating. They were drifting, sliding. Her shoulders sagged like loose hinges. Her knees trembled, unable to hold their natural shape. Her hips were beginning to tilt sideways, each movement sending lightning through her nerves. But what made this torture especially vicious wasn't the mechanics. It was the psychology. The monks would pause between pulls, long pauses, forcing her body to sit in its new broken geometry, forcing her to feel every misalignment. And in those moments, Lamo realized something devastating. No one was coming. Her family couldn't defy temple authority. The rebels she'd helped would never risk returning. Her village would pretend this never happened. That silence was its own form of torture. The next pull came without warning. Her left shoulder wrenched downward, dropping with a brutal, sickening crack. Her head jerked back, a cry punching out of her throat before she could stop it. That sound echoed through the courtyard, sharp, human, undeniable. But the rope still scraped. One monk finally looked into her eyes, not with hatred, with certainty, as if he were witnessing the inevitable collapse of a law of nature. He whispered, "When the joints fall, the will follows." And in that moment, Lamo, trembling, dislocated, and barely conscious, understood the true horror behind this ritual. It wasn't meant to destroy her body. It was meant to destroy her future. By the time Lomo's joints hung loose, trembling in their wrong positions, the courtyard felt different. The air seemed heavier, the prayer flags still, as if even the wind refused to witness what came next. Lomo's breath shook in short, thin gasps, her ribs struggling against the strain of a body no longer aligned with itself. The monks adjusted one rope, then another. Each movement made that same scraping murmur, the dry whisper of fibers dragging across wood. It followed her like a ghost. But now the torture shifted from physical destruction to psychological collapse. The ropes were no longer being pulled to break new joints. Instead, they were pulled to re-break the joints that had already dislocated. A shoulder already torn from its socket could still be rotated. A knee already twisted could be torqued further, forcing her body to accept a position no human should endure. Every stretch sent warped signals through her nerves, confusing her brain into thinking her limbs were floating. That disorientation gave this method another name among those who survived it: the unmooring. Her sense of self began to drift. When the monks loosened one rope, her arm fell limp, dangling with a loose circular sway. That motion sent a shudder through her entire body. She couldn't tell if she still owned her limbs or if they were simply attached to her like lifeless weights. Her vision flickered. The ground beneath her looked tilted, like the world itself had shifted at an angle. And still, scrape, scrape, scrape. That sound became the anchor of her fear. But the deeper horror came from the onlookers. Villagers stood at a distance, pretending not to watch, pretending they had errands or tours nearby. But they were watching, and the monks wanted them to. Because this torture was never just about Lomo. It was about what her suffering would make others choose tomorrow. She was no longer a woman to them. She was a lesson. Suddenly, a shock. A violent jolt of the ropes yanked her left knee fully sideways. The joint slipped, then twisted farther, contorting her leg until her foot dragged behind her like it belonged to someone else. Lomo screamed, the sound ripping raw from her throat, echoing around the stone courtyard. The monks didn't flinch. They waited for the scream to fade, then resumed their calm, deliberate movements. This was cruelty disguised as discipline, a performance of power wrapped in prayer. But the real unpredictable moment came next, one the monks didn't intend. As Lomo's head hung forward, her hair matted with sweat and melting frost, she suddenly lifted her gaze. Her eyes, bloodshot and unfocused, found a small figure near the courtyard entrance. A child. A young girl, maybe 8 years old, clutching a woven basket to her chest. Her mother whispered urgently, trying to pull her away, but the child stood frozen, her face pale with terror. Lomo recognized her. A neighbor's daughter. Someone she'd once carried on her back during a summer festival. In that instant, the torture became something else entirely. The child mouthed the word. Why? A single question, but in that courtyard, it felt like a blade. Why would monks, supposed guardians of compassion, do this? Why must a woman be broken to preserve tradition? Why must truth be punished until its bones collapse? The monks glanced toward the girl, irritation flashing across their faces. The facade of holy discipline cracked. One monk barked an order for the mother to remove the child. The woman bowed frantically and dragged the girl away, her basket spilling into the snow. But that tiny moment, just a few seconds, shattered the illusion that this violence was accepted. The people weren't unmoved. They were afraid. And fear could fracture obedience. The monks resumed the torture, but something had changed.
The courtyard felt unstable. The unspoken agreement between power and silence had trembled. And then came the final pull, the one meant to finish the ritual. They tightened all 4 ropes at once, stretching Lomo's limbs outward in brutal symmetry. Her dislocated joints screamed within her skin. Her legs shook violently, her arms twisted, her body elongated in a grotesque shaking arch. And for the first time that night, Lomo screamed a word not from pain, but from something deeper. "Stop!" Her voice cut through the courtyard like lightning. The monks faltered. A woman who had been dismantled bone by bone still found breath to resist. That moment, unexpected, impossible, was a fracture point that none of them foresaw.
When the monks heard Lamo shout that single word, "Stop," their hands froze mid-pull. It wasn't loud, it wasn't commanding. It was ragged, slurred, soaked in agony. But it was still a refusal. And refusal, even whispered, was the one thing this entire ritual was designed to extinguish. For a heartbeat, the courtyard fell utterly still. No chants, no shifting robes, only her fractured breathing, and the rope's soft scrape as the wind nudged one pole, almost gently, as if the world itself exhaled. That tiny sound, scrape, scrape, became something new, an echo of defiance. The lead monk stepped closer, his expression tightening. This wasn't supposed to happen. A woman whose joints hung loose, whose limbs stretched into shapes no anatomy accepted, was not supposed to muster a voice. The ritual's power depended on the victim's collapse, the breaking of body and will in perfect synchronization. But Lamo's voice had survived where her joints could not. Through blurred vision, she stared at him. Her head dropped forward, but her gaze sharpened, focusing with a clarity she didn't know she still possessed. She wasn't begging, she wasn't submitting, she was demanding an answer to a cruelty masked as tradition. And for a moment, just a flicker, he looked away. Because even he, wrapped in centuries of ritual authority, felt it. The truth pressing inward like cold air through cracked stone. That truth was simple and devastating. Their violence was not sacred. It was not righteous. It was not necessary. It was fear. Fear of women who resisted. Fear of choices they couldn't control. Fear of voices that refused to stay quiet. And nothing exposes fear faster than a victim who refuses to break completely. The ritual resumed because it had to. Power rarely knows how to stop itself. But the monks no longer moved with the same certainty. Their hands hesitated, their chanting wavered. Each adjustment of the ropes sounded harsher than before. Scrape, scrape, as if the very tools of the ritual had grown uneasy. They performed the final stretch mechanically, completing the sequence required to mark Lamo as corrected. Then they released the ropes, letting her broken limbs collapse inward. She fell to the stone with a guttural gasp, her joints settling into grotesque, unnatural angles. The pain was indescribable, white, blinding, merciless. But she was alive, more than alive, present. And they could not silence that. Later, villagers would pretend not to know what happened, walking past her home with lowered eyes. Others whispered that she should have obeyed, that defiance was foolish. But beneath those murmurs lived something the monks feared far more: unease, questions, the quiet rebellion of people who saw what had been done to her and felt a fracture open inside their certainty. Some women began refusing arranged matches more openly. A few families hid dissidents despite the risk. Even monks from other temples began questioning the cruelty woven into their rituals. And in every version of these stories, told in kitchens, in fields, in hushed nighttime gatherings, there was always one detail that never faded: the rope. Everyone remembered the scraping. That soft, steady sound became a symbol of the invisible machinery that had controlled them for generations.
And once named, once heard clearly, machinery can be dismantled. Lamo lived, crippled, unable to lift her arms properly, unable to walk without collapsing. But survival can be louder than strength. Her existence became a quiet rebellion. When she moved through the village with her twisted gait, children asked questions their parents struggled to answer. Women watched her and saw a warning, but also a mirror. And men who once defended temple authority began averting their eyes, suddenly unsure of the righteousness they'd inherited. These stories were meant to vanish into mountain winds, but here in this archive, they won't. We are the voice the victims were never allowed to keep, the memory their tormentors hoped would dissolve in snow and prayer smoke. So here is the question that lingers long after the rope stops scraping. What traditions do we still defend today, simply because we're too afraid to call them what they are? If you believe these histories must be confronted, named, and remembered, stay with us. Add your voice to this archive, because the more people who hear these stories, the fewer places cruelty has left to hide. Subscribe, learn, and resist forgetting.